All right, so we're going to go ahead and dive into a lecture on creating space and perspective. This lecture is going to be more geared towards painting and drawing mediums, but of course, this can apply to any other two-dimensional mediums of your choosing. So let's go ahead and dive in. Primarily, we're going to be talking about five main types of perspective or space topics. And the first, we're going to talk about atmospheric perspective. Second, we're going to overview overlapping forms. 3, we're going to talk about diminishing size. 4, we're going to talk about diagonal lines or planes. And then 5, we're going to talk about linear perspective. So these 5 categories really can create a ample amount of opportunity to create really dynamic and functional spaces and give the illusion of a 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional flat plane. So the first one that we're going to introduce is going to be talking about atmospheric perspective. I've got written definitions for all of these over on the right-hand side, as well as we're going to go through some visuals and look at a lot of different artist works for this lecture. So feel free to stop this video or lecture and review and read some of the information on the side. I've also got this video link posted in the YouTube video, so feel free to check out the lovely PDF or PowerPoint lecture that I've made on your own as well. So we're going to dive into atmospheric perspective. Probably hands down one of the most effective strategies for creating a 3-dimensional space or the illusion and feeling of a 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional plane. Essentially, to break down what atmospheric perspective is it's really talking about distance and creating the relative illusion of distance for the viewer by simply just changing the scale of objects as they reduce clarity as we go back in space, also reducing value and color saturation as objects go back into space. So this is really quite an effective but very simple technique. We're going to go ahead and look at a couple of visual examples to clarify how this may transfer into visual media such as paintings and drawings. The first one that we're going to look at is probably one of the most notorious and famous paintings introducing very clear atmospheric perspective, and that's the Mona Lisa. So if we look at the figure in the foreground, the Mona Lisa herself, we can see very clear value, very clear form definition with outlining of details of her hair, her facial features, the kind of beautiful folds as they wrap around the fabric of her clothes. We can see color saturation, low to high, and all of that wonderful, beautiful warmth of that color richness on her person. But as we look in the foreground and we transition into the back areas of the painting, we start to see a massive shift happening. And this is exactly what I'm talking about with atmospheric perspective, and this is the real power that it can hold. Atmospheric perspective essentially takes objects, forms, or things that exist in background spaces and diminishes the value, saturation of color, and form clarity. So those 3 things add in to create depth or scale. Essentially, the way you want to think about atmospheric perspective is thinking about the physical molecular weight of air or space in between objects, right? As we go back into space, and you can think about this too in a landscape setting when you're walking in a park, as you look in the very far distances, you start to notice that things far away from you have this kind of blue haze to them. Lines aren't very sharp. You don't have graphic images or graphic marks sitting right next to each other, but rather everything looks kind of fuzzy and a teensy bit blurry. Also, you notice that the values start to gray out. There's no high contrast of light or dark, and colors, like I said, start to become neutralized, even going into cooler tones such as blues. So as we can see here, this is a great example of perspective in terms of atmosphere. I'm going to go ahead and just grab out my pointer so we can just kind of give you some visual examples too. And I think even just by looking at the face right here in the center comparatively to that background space, we can just see the big differences and how that form really pops out to us as a figure of the Mona Lisa comparatively to the background where it becomes all fuzzy and desaturated. Another great example of this is Alexander's work. And we can look at this particular work. He was primarily a type of Hudson River Valley painter. So that was a series of artists that lived in America during the kind of the turn of the century, if you will, late 1800s, early 1900s. And essentially they were really focused on capturing the natural beauty and the sublime of nature in the Americas. We can see them really primarily focused in New York, but they do stretch beyond that kind of area as well. But this is a really great example of that kind of sublime nature coming in. So we can see how atmospheric perspective is working here. And we're going to look at just a couple of different examples in this painting. But I first want us to look over on the right-hand side of the image, or the painting. If we look at the forms of the trees, the animals, and some of the root systems or grass that are closest to us, we start to notice those three characteristics again, right? Our color is very vivid and saturated. We not only have warm tones, but we have cool tones working there. There's also an extreme amount of value being presented in the foreground, right? We have light values, we have dark values, we have very rich and deep tonal structures of both 0 white to 10 black on our value scale, and all of those wonderful contrasting values in between. And we also have a very clear definition of form. Harder edges are sitting next to other edges, and softing blending marks are appearing in the ground. But there is definite kind of structure and form adding into the trees, the animals, the ground spaces below, and we can really clearly identify those objects. As we transition into the background and even in some areas of the midground with some of those animals, notice how the color starts to fade away, right? We do have a warmer sense of color here, primarily because this is trying to capture that kind of golden hour, so the hues do become warmer, but we do notice that that color starts to shift and become a little bit more flat. There's not as dimension or as much dimension in our color range, meaning that it stays all one type of tone, and it becomes desaturated as we go further back in space, meaning it starts to gray out, right? We also can start to look at the forms and notice there's this blurriness or fuzziness, and as we go all the way into the very background where the mountains appear, we can start to see that there's very little kind of line, form, color, and value that is actually becoming distinguishable from the sky space behind the mountain. So what I'm meaning is that this form becomes extremely fuzzy, almost disappearing into that sky. And this is a great example of atmospheric perspective working out and playing in front of us. So even not having a typical type of linear perspective here, we're able to understand the space, and we are able to get a kind of vast space at that, just because he's applying this kind of simple element of atmospheric perspective. We're going to go ahead and talk about overlapping forms. Overlapping forms is quite an easy and very simple, effective technique for creating space. Essentially, what it's going to talk about is visual stacking of objects. So objects that are closest to the foreground, objects behind that first object, and then objects all the way in the background. So essentially, just thinking about things stacking behind one another as we go back into space can create a very effective viewpoint for the position of the viewer to understand where they're sitting in relation to those objects as they recede back into space. So let's go ahead and look at some visual examples of this. So we're going to look at this Charles Riddell work. And now this is a London-based artist. He's known for a lot of his rural and urban kind of scenes. His collage and drawing works are pretty popular. But I think this is a really great example of how you can start to even warp or distort pretty drastically linear perspective, but you can still create a very effective space just by using overlapping forms. So if we start to look at certain elements of this work or of this drawing, we're noticing that he's drawing on separate pieces of paper, then cutting that out, and then putting that on top of other drawings. So he's not only thinking about overlapping forms formally, but also quite literally with his collage drawing methods. But if we start to look at these forms, they're relatively the same size as we move back into space. This form is roughly pretty close to the size of this form. Now we know from thinking about things in linear perspective that this form should appear quite larger comparatively to this form. There is a little bit of size or scale change here, but it's not as drastic or as large as it should be to be true linear perspective. And in fact, if we start to compare this form with this form, these people are actually a lot larger compared to this form, even though they're still in the same kind of line or plane of the foreground. So there's different kind of size scale forms here, but the way we're creating space is because of the overlap. We read these figures as sitting in front of these figures, even though they're relatively the same size. Same here. These forms are actually larger technically than some of these forms, But because we have overlapping forms behind those objects in the foreground or these people in the foreground, we're reading it as a space. So overlapping objects is quite simply able to create very effective strategies, very effective forms for creating foreground, middle ground, and background. We can even think about this too in the kind of cafe window that's showing that cityscape behind. We're reading that this is our kind of ground that we are in, the cafe, and then we read that that space extends past us, going farther back into space with that cityscape and impression of those buildings in the background because they're tucked behind, aka that overlap, behind this cafe window. Another great example of this is John Woodrow Wilson's print work. He's a pretty famous painter kind of in the 1940s, 60s, 70s, and has really makes some amazing kind of modern print works and drawings. This is a very kind of simple work in some ways and how it's set up, but it's quite effective and quite sophisticated with just the overlapping forms and how we create space. It does feel very claustrophobic primarily because we have a lot of a massive kind of structure of the figure and we're very close to the figure and there's not a lot of negative space for us to interact with. So this is a very active image. It's a very tight image, but we can still read this kind of space being opened up to us behind that figure because of the way he's stacking forms. If we look at the wall here, right, we see this kind of sheetrock, then the bricks that he's kind of making, the figure behind that, so it gives us once again that sense of depth and scale that shifts even. We have that kind of architectural forms as they're laying behind each other, giving us this really wide sense of depth. And once again, this is not technically linear perspective here. This is incorrect linear perspective, but yet it reads like a very real space that we can enter into and create depth going backwards in space because of just simple overlapping forms. So like I said, very simple strategy, but very effective when used. And I think that this is going to be really important too in this conversation. We don't necessarily have to always think about, oh, I'm going to use this one method of creating space. Overlap multiple of these 5 techniques that I'm talking about, or all 5 together. You can just simply stick to one, but over the course of this lecture, and we've already kind of seen this with previous examples, there might be different strategies or multiple strategies of these creating space methods that are being applied through a work overall. So like I said, don't limit yourself to just one, but think about them kind of working in tandem with each other as well, because there is some scale change as well as some diagonal forms that are present in this work that we're going to talk later on about that are active in some of these images as well. All right, diminishing size. So this is going to talk about essentially objects appearing smaller as they get further away from the viewer. Essentially just reducing that kind of object scale as we move closer to the horizon line. So once again, very similar kind of strategy and a very kind of small thing, but it adds to a very large effect for creating scale and depth and size and space to a work. So this is normally the point in class where I'm asking you to do a small exercise, so just humor me at this point, and I'm just going to assume that we're all doing it together. But I want everyone to kind of close their eyes. This is going to be a small class exercise or a little experiment, like I said, but at this time I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to extend your arm forward into space, and I want you to kind of lock your joint here and kind of create a nice parallel arm with the floor. Essentially, I want you to stick your thumb up like you're hitchhiking, and then I want you to kind of gauge the perspective size of your thumb and gauge how large that thumb is in reference to an object that is behind your thumb. So right now when I'm looking at this, I'm actually looking at my pretty large winter parka jacket. So it's like a full-length jacket that goes down to my knees. And when I'm looking at that and I'm comparing that to the size of my thumb right now, and like I said, this can be anything that's just in front of your thumb. I'm just using that as my example. My thumb is actually the same size from top to bottom of my thumb as my winter parka jacket. Now this is going to very simply illustrate this idea, and some of you may have already kind of understood this from previous art classes, or perhaps this is the first time that you're really looking at that, kind of paying attention to that space. But essentially what I'm doing is talking about scale chains and size of objects. Now I know my thumb isn't the size of my full winter parka that goes down to my knees, but yet it is appearing that way. And this is is once again talking about size perspective, and objects that are closer to us in the foreground are going to become much larger, much more saturated, higher value, right? Think about that atmospheric perspective stuff. But objects that are sitting in the foreground are going to become much larger, and as we recede into the background, they're going to become much smaller, okay? So this is a simple little exercise giving you that idea, right? And there's my written description describing that. All right, so let's go ahead and look at some of this visual phenomenon that talks about scale change to create size, or to create space in an artwork. We're going to go ahead and look at Christo's work. So this is a French group, a married couple that worked during the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, but primarily they're installation artists. But they're often known for these massive kind of installation land works, and with also their very intensive studies of these land works. They often created a variety of different sketches. So this is one of their sketches. We're going to look at some of their installation photography works, just like the photographs of their installations. But I like to show you their drawing works too, because they made some really beautiful drawings. But the big thing that they focus on too with creating space is primarily just that scale and form change. And what I mean by that is if we look at the umbrellas in our foreground, look at how large they are. They take up, just these 3 umbrellas, takes up the whole entire span of our bottom half of the image. And as we move back into space, we can see that these umbrellas sitting in our midground and even somewhat background become very small. Now, as we go up this mountain space, if we look at the very top, there are little tiny umbrellas, right? So once again, this is establishing foreground, middle ground, background, and that scale change of the umbrellas as it goes back in space creates a massive amount of scale and space for us to enter into the image as a viewer. So like I said, a very effective strategy and very simple. Now, if we go back to that idea, and as I said before, really look at all 5 of these kind of ideas that we're going to talk about for creating space, these methods, right? You can overlap them. But if we look at this one, really we don't see any atmospheric perspective at all, right? And this saturation is still the same color as the saturation here. We can still make out very strong value distinctions as we can in the foreground, and almost, our kind of forms are still registering very clearly and sharply as they are in the foreground. So there's no application of atmospheric perspective here, but really the only thing that's playing is overlapping forms and then scale change, okay? So this is really effective, like I said. All right. So let's go ahead and look at their umbrellas as they function in their larger installation in California. Or in Japan, sorry. Anyways, so we're going to go ahead and look at the major scale change. Now, of course, this is a photograph, so we're going to see a lot more of those kind of other 5 techniques or methods to create space existing in this because it's a photograph. But let's go ahead and just review that diminishing scale or diminishing size as a method. So if we look at our first umbrella that's closest to us in the foreground, it's quite large. It takes up a good chunk of the image. I would say even like 2/3 of the image technically, right? Just on how much area space it takes up in the frame. And as we go into the midground, we can see the big scale jump this takes. And as we go even further back, once again, another large scale change. And then as we go further all the way almost into the top of the image, we can see just tiny little yellow dots of those umbrellas. So this creates a massive effective area for just us entering into the space, thinking about, wow, that space really stretches out. And we can do this in drawings and paintings like that. It's a very easy technique, but it just has a tremendous amount of effect, visual phenomenon-wise, on our subconscious and also visually, right? Or conscious and subconscious, I guess you could technically say. But also we too start to see overlapping forms working here as well. So that gives us some additional kind of strength for creating more space. And also we see atmospheric perspective, right? We look at the big color changes here in the foreground comparatively to the background. This gets much bluer, lighter in value, and the values in general just become more grayed out. They don't become as contrasting as they are in the foreground. And also we can start to see that kind of gray-blue existing in the background as well. So there's a lot of other types of visual method and techniques here for creating space operating in this particular photograph. So just keep that in mind too, to overlap and think about these forms together, or these methods together. All right. So let's talk about another visual phenomenon called foreshortening. Now, this is going to be very similar to how we think about that little exercise that we just did with our thumb. Essentially, what this talks about is scale change on a very drastic proportion. Essentially, foreshortening appears on forms when they are at a very oblique and drastic angle from the viewer, meaning that the kind of angle of object is a really dynamic kind of angle. So if we look at our Salvador Dali painting, we can look at the feet of Christ as it's going backwards towards the heaven space. Our feet look quite large comparatively to the head space. And this is correct. This reads correctly to us both consciously and formally, because this is actually how we would see the space operating naturally if we were to look at this in real life, right? The legs or the feet are much closer to the viewer than the head is. So it's going to make sense that that space is much larger comparatively to that head because it's further away from us. And this is what foreshortening is. Essentially, it's a very extreme or an oblique angle, which puts the object in a viewpoint that has a very drastic perspective change from the beginning to the end of the object. Now, if we look at a kind of earlier version of the death of Christ, that kind of limitations of Christ, we can start to see that genre or that type of painting has been reworked over the centuries multiple times. And of course, we see kind of Salvador Dali doing that too in the 1950s. But if we go back quite a bit of time to 1480, we can look at this particular work, and this feels just not quite right. And this is where we can start to see the power of foreshortening, and also some of its, if it's not done right, how it can feel quite visually odd for us as human beings. Primarily, when we have our foreground space here, our feet should be much larger, right? Because we just established things in the foreground are going to become larger in the frame for us because they're closer to us as the viewer. Now, as we extend all the way into the background, things should start to become smaller, dissipated, right? All of that kind of form should become a little bit smaller in size and scale. But if we look at his head, that is absolutely massive compared to his feet. And this is because it's not properly foreshortened. Of course, at this time they were starting to figure out linear perspective and start to understand more of these kind of space creating techniques. So that's why this still looks a little funny. But if we go back to this image, this feels right to us, okay? So also think about foreshortening, especially we see a lot of foreshortening when it comes to figures. So if you're working with figurative work, this is going to be something to really think about critically if you're working from line down angles or angles, like I said, that are quite oblique or dramatic. Think about foreshortening and how much you should actually measure to give us that space allotment for scale change. All right, let's talk about diagonal forms and diagonal planes. This is actually quite an effective strategy as well, and it's really quite simple once again. We're really talking about, once again, oblique lines or diagonal lines or planes that give us space or create space. And essentially the logic here is that we're challenging the vertical and horizontal images or frame that we normally associate with paintings and drawings. And what I mean by that is if you look right now on your screen, the normal viewing orientation that we're given to us is that there are horizontal bars running top and bottom and vertical lines on the left and right of our screen. That is framing our space. Now, when we also see TV shows and movies or paintings and drawings in museums or wherever in our house, we're normally seeing vertical to horizontal lines. Also go back to that idea of a park, right? You're walking through a park. We're used to seeing a horizontal ground plane that maybe stacks up, or a horizontal line creating our horizon line, or vertical trees going up and down, or buildings going up and down. That's our normal kind of viewing orientation. So when we start adding diagonal or rectangular planes to compare or contrast with those borders or those kind of normal associations with vertical and horizontal lines, it actually starts to challenge the viewer in creating space. And when we think about angular lines, that actually has a speed to it. It takes us back into space. So when we can simply create a really effective type of visual strategy or space creating strategy just by adding angled forms or planes into our space to maximize the impression of distance, okay? All right, so let's look at some visual examples of that. First off, we're going to look at some Xiao Bing's work. Of course, I've talked about him probably a couple of times in class already. If I haven't, I'm sorry. He's an amazing artist. He not only does like prints and drawings and paintings, but he's also into sculpture and installation. So he pretty much does a little bit of everything. But this is actually a study for a print that he's going to make, and it's a little watercolor drawing, and it's really quite beautiful, or graphite drawing with pencil. So it's really quite beautiful. And when we're looking at this, really linear perspective is pretty much abandoned in here. It looks like it might appear in some of the buildings, but if we actually look at where those horizontal lines are going back, they don't actually go back to any particular point on the horizon line or a vanishing point. Rather, they're just kind of impressions of planes that are sitting there to give us the illusion of buildings, right? If we look at our linear perspective, like I said, that's not there. If we look at our atmospheric perspective, the forms in the very far background do not appear to be any different than the forms in the foreground. If we look at stacking objects, there are some stacking forms here, especially when we get into the cityscape, but primarily these are just zigzagging lines going up, right? Our staircase and those planes and lines that are being created by that staircase is giving us the depth. And boy, does it give us a lot of depth. We really see the kind of ebb and flow of this space being created because of these drastic planes of horizontal or of vertical lines going back up and stacking in space. So vertical lines like this, or excuse me, diagonal lines like this can really challenge those horizontal and vertical planes and really effectively create a very dramatic sense of scale, distance, and space and two-dimensional works. So don't abandon those kind of diagonal lines, and you can, like I said, have diagonal lines in a work and be a little bit more abstract about it and not necessarily have to have a true linear perspective, and yet they still create a great amount of space. Let's look at some more abstracted work, and we're going to look at some of Rich and Diebenkorn's prints. So this was a really beautiful aquatint here. And this is actually a very abstracted landscape. And it's technically of kind of a farm field or kind of an urban, or not an urban, but a kind of a village, kind of farm field kind of space. So a rural, there we go. I'm trying to get the word right. But this doesn't feel very like metropolitan. This has more of a farm kind of aesthetic, a landscape that you might appear in Wisconsin, maybe somewhere, as you're driving in between cities. So what we're seeing mostly in here is just diagonal lines. Once again, it's challenging that vertical and horizontal plane of that pictorial frame. And by just adding kind of these zipping diagonal lines, these kind of oblique lines, we're actually able to create really effective space. So if we look at kind of that print in a larger sequence of that kind of work, we can see the variations of these different types of planes. And like I said, even though this is an abstracted piece of work, it actually does give the viewer a sense of scale. And if we look at this middle one, notice how this goes more vertical and horizontal. This space doesn't feel as grand as maybe this space or even these two, right? Those four on the outside feel like you can enter into it. And that's primarily just because of those diagonal lines. Now, diagonal lines and diagonal planes, like I said, can create a vast amount of space even in abstracted forms like this. So don't underestimate the value of just working with diagonal line or diagonal planes or shapes in your work. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into linear perspective. Now, linear perspective, you've most likely seen this or even drawn this in an art class. This is essentially talking about creating a system of lines and points in which you're going to create the illusion of depth on a flat surface. So we're going to go ahead and start talking about how to create these systems of convergence using vanishing points and a stable horizon line. So let's go ahead and look at some visual examples. So the first kind of introduction into linear perspective is thinking about the horizon line. The horizon line is symbolic for multiple reasons. It's going to first establish where your viewpoint is or your vanishing point is, but it's also going to teach you a little bit about your space as well. And what I mean by that is your horizon line is always going to be equal distance and equal to your eye level line. So whether you're sitting up or standing up tall, that is actually where your horizon line is going to be, and it's going to be completely straight on with that eye level line. Now, of course, when we start to tilt our head down or tilt our head up, that doesn't mean our horizon line moves with us, but rather it stays completely straight and parallel if we're in a fixed position like this. And or rather, our perspective might change in terms of angles of lines, but our horizon line is never going to change. Like I said, the only time your horizon or eye level line is going to change is if you stand up or you sit down, okay? So this is also going to be important too for drawing and painting. thinking about where our horizon line is going to sit and how we're going to space ourselves in relationship to our frame. And what I mean by that is if we're sitting down, we need to stay seated in our chair throughout the kind of painting process, especially when we're working from observation. Now, when we get into abstraction, you can have kind of abandon that strategy or idea. But if you're drawing from observation and you're working on a more realism type of piece, you need to make sure that your perspective stays stable throughout the entirety of that drawing or painting process. So that's why it's important to either say, okay, I'm going to commit to standing up for this work, or I'm going to commit to sitting down, and keep records of where you're sitting in relation to your objects, because it can alter quite a bit, especially when you're sitting or when you're standing and you move around a lot. All right, so I've got this really lovely and very cheesy image of myself, but this very simply illustrates that kind of idea, right? That the horizon line is always going to be equal distance to my eye level line. And as I'm closer to the foreground, you can see this is cutting directly into my eye level line. As I move back into space, notice how my form starts to get smaller, right? My head is shrinking, my body is shrinking as I'm moving back in space, but my eye level line is staying equal distance to that horizon line in the background. Now, as I move all the way back against my wall, you can see my form is much smaller in comparison, but yet my eye level line is still equal distance from that horizon line, aka your eye level line and your horizon line are the same thing, okay? So that's the easiest way to find it. You can also look at the horizon line and how you might find it. This is a good maybe exercise to do next time you're at the grocery store. Start looking at the horizontal planes or lines of the grocery store shelves and start to see where maybe they start to level out. And what I mean by that is if you can see under them, if you're looking above like this, or if you can see below them and see the top of the shelf, that means that your horizon line is going to be in between those two spots. So look for where that line actually becomes straight and you can't see the top or bottom of that grocery shelf line. You can do this too at home if you have a brick wall, or let's say if you have any shelves behind you, right? You can simply look at those lines, and if, like I said, you can see the top of the shelf or the bottom of the shelf, that's going to let you know that you might need to go under or go higher to find your horizon line. So this could be, like I said, a good practicing thing for you to do. Here's a nice definition of that horizon line for you. Like I said, you feel free to pause and read that if you want. Our second kind of main point in vanishing or in linear perspective, and the second term that we're going to talk about is vanishing points. Vanishing points can appear either in 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, 4 point, and beyond. But essentially for 1 point and 2 point perspective, your vanishing point is going to appear on your horizon line. Essentially what a vanishing point is, it's essentially where in a perspective, that's where all of those lines are going to converge. So meaning if we're looking at a 1 point or 2 point perspective, our horizontal lines are going to converge at those points, meaning that they do not go past those points, but they're always going to go to those points. Whether that, like I said, that's just 1 point and 1 point perspective or 2 points and 2 point perspective, okay? So always know that that's where your horizontal planes are going to run parallel and converge onto those vanishing points. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we dive into other types of perspective, like 3 point or 4 point. That's when that rule kind of changes a little bit. But for the most part, when we're drawing and painting from observation, we're going to be dealing with 1 point, 2 point, or like I said, 3 point, or even multi-point. So we'll talk about that as we kind of move along, and we'll give you some visual examples on how you might need to think about that space. All right, so let's go into a brief history. So in the 14th century, Giotto was kind of known or considered to be the father of perspective. And then in the 15th century, Italian goldsmith and clockmaker Filippo Brunelleschi was actually the kind of formal creator of perspective as we know it today. The reason I like to introduce this is just to kind of give you this kind of narrative about art and how it's progressed so far. Here is a picture of some of Giotto's paintings. As we can see, this is the first time that we really start to have those diagonal planes actually entering into a work. We can also see stacked forms for the first time as well. So he was one of these kind of founding fathers of perspective because he introduced this idea of depth for us. And that's why it's important to study his work. Those diagonal lines, those kind of stacked planes or stacked shapes, and even diminishing scale and size, he was the first person to kind of figure that that's actually how we saw space. As we can see, and as we move along, it's not quite right, but he's starting to figure something out, and that he's realizing, like I said, those stacked planes or those lines that are diverging or going back to some point in space is actually how we start to see space. And now we go to Filippo Brunelleschi, and as we look at his work on the Domo, in which I'm not going to get fully into this piece of engineering and architectural mastery that he did on this work, but if you are interested, I do include a link. This is like one of my favorite buildings just because it's so amazing on how it was built. And really today, modern architects and engineers still don't really know how this was built. They have ideas, but there was no formal plans that were left or saved behind. So this is kind of still a modern marvel and a big mystery behind it. But essentially, he had to create this dome-like structure. It's not a true dome, and actually, it's not completely circled, or it doesn't have a complete kind of symmetrical form to it. So like I said, there was some real engineering that went into this space, and that's actually how we figured out perspective. He started using blueprints to map this space out and not only figure out the math of it, but he also started using perspective drawing as a way to understand how this form is going to operate in space. So he was actually the first person to figure out the laws and principles of linear perspective. And we still use these principles today, thinking about the horizon line, thinking about vanishing points, and that converging of those lines on the horizon or vanishing point itself. So these are going to be some of the types of linear perspective that we're going to talk about: 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, multi-point, 4 point, and 5 point. Linear perspective does go beyond 5 point perspective. We're not going to talk about it for this particular lecture. Normally that's for more advanced lectures, and if you're interested, feel free to ask me about that, and we can talk about that further. But for just simplicity's sake, we're going to talk about it from here, and we're going to introduce some of these concepts. So 1 point perspective. Now this is going to be pretty natural as we move along. 1 point perspective only talks about one vanishing point. So once again, we're going to have a horizon line that can be high on our page, in the middle of our page, or either very low on the page. It doesn't necessarily matter. It just depends on how you're drawing it, what you're seeing, and what kind of vantage point you want to give or perspective point you want to give for your viewer. So essentially, we're going to start with a horizon line, and then you're going to find where all of these horizontal planes converge, and that's actually going to be where your one vanishing point is. So 1 point perspective is just one vanishing point. Same thing for 2 point, 3 point, 4 point, and goes on, right? We're going to figure out what vanishing point that we're drawing from is, and that's going to determine our perspective that we're working with. So for here, we have a 1 point, which is sitting here on our horizon line. Same over here, our horizon line can't technically be seen because it's behind these buildings and the bushes, but our horizon line is here. And then once again, if we look at all of these horizontal planes and lines, they all converge at this one spot, right? So this is our vanishing point right here. So this is a good example of 1 point perspective. Now, as we move forward, we're going to look at 2 point perspective. 2 point perspective is going to follow very similar rules in some way. We're going to start off with establishing where our horizon line is in our pictorial frame. And then we're going to plot in where our 2 points of vanishing kind of information, aka where all those horizontal planes go to and converge. And then that's going to be where our second points are. Now, both of our points are actually in these drawings. For a lot of examples of drawing, you might actually find that your vanishing points sit outside of your pictorial frame or your page. So just be aware of that. Often, if you do have an instance where, let's say, you have an image and your horizon line and your vanishing points fall outside of that image, it might be a good idea to take some extra paper, put that or attach that to your board. And when I say paper, maybe it might be better to get some like cardboard or some chipboard. Take off a large section of that, put that and attach that to your drawing board behind your paper, and extend your horizon line and figure out where your vanishing points sit on those horizon lines. Draw in your vanishing points on those extra little wings that you've extended from your board. And in that way, it will help you figure out how you might need to actually draw your vanishing points and horizon and perspective and all that good stuff in the future. Because it can be a little bit complicated, especially to make a really true, accurate perspective if you don't have your vanishing points where you can easily take your ruler and extend it out to that space. All right, so that's going to be a good example of two-point perspective. As I can see, we have a very clear, definitive horizon line and then vanishing points here. And they even show track and guidelines just so you can see where those vanishing points go. Here we have a nice horizon line here. It's being mostly cut off by these buildings, but we have a vanishing point here, and then we have a vanishing point here. So we can see very clear two-point perspectives there. Once again, two vanishing points is going to equal two-point perspective. All right, the very rare instance where we'll have a two-point perspective, I just like to introduce this because sometimes this might be a thing. Very rarely do we actually see two-point perspective. Mostly, if we see a two-point perspective, that's going to be close to, if we're standing in front of a three-story building, most of the time it dips into three-point perspective, but I do just like to point that out because sometimes that may happen. All right, that's going to take us into three-point perspective. This is where it gets a little bit challenging. So this is where we might need to pay attention here when we're starting our drawing. Once you've figured out one-point perspective and two-point perspective, then you'll be good to go. Once we get into three-point perspective, that's when we're going to kind of throw another kind of point in and things start to rattle the cage a little bit. So what I mean by that is that we're dealing with a third vanishing point and three-point perspective. So essentially the best way to start this off is think about drawing your form in two-point perspective. Once again, we're going to start off with a horizon line, and then we're going to figure out where our horizontal planes are converging for our 1 and 2nd points on that horizon line, and then we'll figure out where our third plane or point exists. And what I mean by that is we have two essentially types of three-point perspective. And that's going to be a term called worm's eye view or bird's eye view. Some of you may understand these terms or recognize maybe some of these drawings. I like to give the example of this is like our Spider-Man perspectives. A lot of superhero movies tend to have, really drastic kind of angles in them where we might see a bird's eye perspective or even a worm's eye perspective in the case of Ant-Man. I don't know. But we might see those kind of for high drama and high action type of scenes. So keep that in mind too. This is a great way to add some characteristic or drama or even heightened emotional senses and scales into your work by adding three-point perspective for your works. But essentially your third point or your vanishing point is going to either be above the horizon line or below the horizon line. So if we look in these examples, essentially what is changing here is your vertical planes, instead of being straight like they have been thus far, we're going to actually look at our vertical lines going down to our third point. And like I said, you're going to have to track those lines up, put a ruler on those lines, create some guidelines going up to that point, and where those lines cross is where you're going to actually find your third point. You can obviously, you're going to be doing that too with your second, with your 1 point and 2 point perspective. So it's the same kind of basic knowledge, right? Just follow those lines until they converge all at 1 point, and that's going to give you your third point. Multi-point perspective. This one's a little bit harder in some ways to see, and actually we kind of deal with this one a lot more than what we might actually think. Particularly, we might see this in staircases quite a bit, or objects that are stacked in multiple different areas, meaning that they're not necessarily all lined up for us in a nice even row, like a building or a landscape might be. So these are two good examples of multi-point perspective. And with multi-point perspective, we're going to have one consistent horizon line, and we're going to actually have multiple points appearing on that horizon line. So it's not going to be like three-point perspective where we have a third point existing above or below the horizon line, but rather we'll have a horizon line with multiple dots on that horizon line, okay? So here's my good example, and this is where I ask everybody to identify this particular perspective. Now, in 1 point perspective, normally we see the front-facing side of an object, and then one side or either the top and bottom. With 2 point perspective, we'll actually see a corner piece of the work, but if we look at this particular work, we start to really look at where these lines are going back to in space, right? We're looking at that convergence point, and suddenly we're realizing that this is actually a lot more complicated. And this is where we get into a good example of multi-point perspective and how we see a lot of multi-perspectives in our actual everyday life. When we are doing still lifes, 9 times out of 10, it depends on how the still life is set up, so I don't want to say 9 times out of 10. But a lot of the cases where we see still lifes, we actually are looking at multi-point perspective. So if you get really confused when you're sitting down to draw a still life, and you're thinking, man, this is like all over the place. There's not just two consistent vanishing points, and that's because you're working with a multi-point perspective. So those lines are going to, or those vanishing points are not going to all converge on maybe one point, but rather you need to look at an individual object and say, okay, where are those lines or planes of those objects going back to for that one particular object, okay? All right, curvilinear perspectives. This is when we get past our 3-point perspective and go into 4-point or 5-point. Really, anything past 5-point is more of a circular type of perspective frame. So we might have concave or convex types of mirrors. I like to give the reference of M.C. Escher on this, where you have multiple points of perspective, and it gives us a very, like I said, concave kind of image where he's kind of in the space. But this, like I said, when we start to get into 4-point perspective and 5-point perspective, that's when we start thinking about creating more curvilinear perspective lines. So I always like to talk about 4-point perspective in the type of framework to talk about Jack and the Beanstalk, right? When you're dealing with godly large figures, right? This is maybe where you might start to see a 4-point perspective. So objects that are appearing at our bottom points or top points are going to become smaller. They're going to start to expand in the middle of the space, and as they go back to those two vanishing points on the horizon line, they're going to once again become smaller or dissipate. So 4-point perspective is a pretty good example for this little drawing here. And then, like I said, 5-point perspective deals with some grid line structures, and essentially you're going to start off with a horizon line like normal, establish your 2 points, your third point is going to be in the middle, and then you'll actually have 2 points right above that center point. This can shift a little bit, and you can kind of do some wonkier things here, but typically 5-point perspective is going to be like a cross on the horizon line. And then from there, you'll be able to create these kind of track or guidelines for more curving edges to create more of a rounded perspective to give you your 5 points, okay? So that's going to go ahead and conclude our Creating Space and Perspective demo lecture. Hopefully you will have a better well-working understanding or better well-rounded knowledge of how to create space for drawings and paintings, and also how to think about linear space as well. This video will most likely be attached to some in-class demos and further kind of examples of perspective drawing. So just stay tuned for that. Hopefully you've enjoyed this lecture. Feel free to click the link or rewatch as much as needed. Other than that, have a great day and happy drawing or painting.